Yoko Sato is a researcher at Hosei University in Japan. She conducted a research study investigating the oral communication problems of Japanese university students learning English, specifically focusing on the cross-cultural pragmatic problems experienced by a native speaker interlocutor. The study's aim was to garner a better understanding of the problems experienced by the communicators themselves during contextualized interaction. This study focuses on oral communication because there is a lack of education surrounding oral communication of English in Japan. The focus is more on written communication of English. Sato explains that past research has failed to provide a holistic picture of cross-cultural pragmatic problems due to the studies being conducted separately in different fields, each with narrow focuses. The research question Sato asked was what features of Japanese EFL, English as a Foreign Language Learners, performance caused pragmatic problems as perceived by a native speaker interlocutor in a face-to-face interaction. This question expands from J. Thomas's concept in Cross-Cultural Pragmatic Failure, 1983, where he defined a pragmatic problem as a failure or difficulty interpreting the learner-speaker's intention or maintaining interaction. The focus on this study is on the perception of the native speaker interlocutor and not the observational analysis of the interaction. This study consisted of 32 students who had an immediate level of proficiency in English. Interactions between participants was conducted through a video-recorded one-on-one face-to-face interview. The interview was conducted by a native speaker interlocutor. The study used retrospective verbal report techniques, known as RVRs. The main reason RVRs were used is so that they could provide information as to which learner features caused pragmatic problems, how it impacts communication, and whether the learners are aware that their actions are seen as negative by the native speaker. Prior to the start of the interviews, a 15-minute interaction task was asked of the learners to understand what level of English oral proficiency they had. The task was based on the speaking test of the preliminary English test and the Cambridge First Certificate in English. The interviews were visually and orally recorded to be used as a recollection cue to provoke retrospective verbal reports. All participants were made aware of the recording devices in advance of the interviews. As pragmatic problems are rarely expressed by the person responsible, and consequently not noticeable in observational data, retrospective verbal reports were used in this study to allow the participants to recall their thoughts during the interview. The retrospective verbal reports were conducted after the interview so that the participants would have their thoughts readily available. The researcher would first speak to the native speaker interlocutor, and then those responses were used to gain an understanding of the learner's perspective. All participants were asked only to express thoughts that they knew they had during the interview and not ones that they had thought in hindsight. The retrospective verbal reports were conducted in the language preferred by the participants in order to gain a full understanding of their thought processes. All reports given in Japanese were translated into English by the researcher. At the end of each retrospective verbal report, the learners were asked to fill out a questionnaire about their perception of the RVR. 23 out of 32 of the learners did not have any difficulty providing responses during their RVR, and 26 of the learners reported they could verbalize more than 80% of their thoughts. None of the learners thought the RVR were demotivating towards future English learning, with 28 of the learners actually more motivated to improve their English proficiency. The results from the study showed that the native speaker interlocutor found that pauses, turned initial silences, lack of eye contact, under-elaborated responses, and flat intonation caused the most pragmatic problems. The native speaker found that these things projected an unwillingness to communicate and a lack of interest by the learner. 68 serious instances of pragmatic problems were found across more than 80% of the learners. The three biggest issues were pauses. Long, silent pauses were the most problematic, inappropriate prosody, mainly flat intonation, and inappropriate body language, such as lack of eye contact. The native speaker also reported on under-elaboration and use of Japanese as issues. Long, silent pauses were considered the worst possible thing to do by the native speaker interlocutor, as it showed a lack of communication. The native speaker also found that turning initial pauses disturbing, and it felt like the learner did not have an interest in maintaining a conversation. The RVRs of the learners showed that most of the pauses were due to the learners attempting to find a suitable English word to describe what they wanted to say. The native speaker interlocutor was also displeased by under-elaborated responses, especially in questions that felt simple. It left the interlocutor feeling uncomfortable as the minimalistic responses seemed disconcerting and taxing, as it required the interlocutor to repeatedly ask follow-up questions. Many learners stated in their RVRs that in school they were told to answer straight to the point and only provide one piece of information per response, something that differentiates them from the native speaker interlocutor. The study found three important pieces of information. Number one, the results suggested that the combined use of a face-to-face interactive task and the RVRs to be effective in uncovering the reality of cross-cultural pragmatic problems. Number two, as stated by D. Fujimoto in Nonverbal Communication and Pragmatics, 2003, effective communication does not rely on spoken words alone. Number three, the learners weren't aware of the negative impact they were having on the native speaker interlocutor. To conclude, Sato states that the seriousness of pragmatic problems and the learner's lack of awareness demanded the incorporation of pragmatics in learning English as a second language in oral communication pedagogy, and that the effectiveness of such instruction on Japanese English first language learners will be an area for future investigation. This study was conducted efficiently, however it seemed to be very specific, and due to the lack of participants, 32, it didn't seem like it was providing a large enough range of evidence. The study also didn't consider the fact that the native speaker interlocutor could have been biased, impatient, or inconsiderate in their thoughts. They did address the fact that the other interlocutors could have been less sympathetic, but decided not to include more than one due to variable data. However, I think having a range of native speaker interlocutors would have been more beneficial in order to obtain the crucial data. All this study tells me is that 32 English language learners were perceived as uncommunicative by this one person. The study also mentions how oral communication of English hasn't been as highly regarded as written communication of English until recently, and Sato emphasizes that we need to focus on education on oral communication of English. So I would have liked to have seen a written part of this study where the questions are the same as the ones given in the face-to-face interviews. This would have created a few issues with the study, e.g. the participant already knowing the questions prior, but I think the comparative data would be imperative to the point Sato was making about the importance of oral communication of English needed to be emphasized more in education. I also found that the study was presented in an awkward manner. Information was repeated and some points of information are brought up again, and overall it just felt very disjointed and I found myself having to reorder the study in my head to make sense of some parts. The repetitiveness of some information just made the study long-winded and exhausting to read. Given the amount of information provided prior to the results seemed to be brief and didn't really go into depth about specific results, only giving examples on a few short ones.